The storm had wrung the valley dry. It left the prairie holding its breath, waiting. Thomas Ward stood in his doorway, a chipped mug of coffee getting cold in his hand. He was just a rancher, a man with leaning fences and too few cattle. But yesterday he'd been something else. Yesterday he'd dragged 3 women from a creek that wanted to swallow them whole. Now they were walking back out of the morning mist. 3 tall figures, moving with a gravity that made the air feel thick. Their shoulders were squared. Their steps were in perfect rhythm. This wasn't a thank-you visit. This was a verdict. They stopped 10 paces from his porch and formed a straight line, their eyes locking onto him. They weren't grateful. They weren't pleading. They were measuring him. Thomas felt his old ranch house shrink behind him, its sagging roof suddenly no protection at all. Then the brush parted at the tree line. A 4th shape stepped into the light. He was broad across the shoulders, a feathered headdress catching the first gold of the sun. He didn't hurry. He moved like the silence was his to command. Chief Kuruk. Thomas's heartbeat climbed into his throat. He'd planned on mending fence wire today. A quiet morning. Instead, a chief had come to balance a ledger Thomas never even knew he'd opened. Kuruk raised a hand. The 3 women went still, as if a single wire connected them all. When the chief spoke, his voice cut clean across the clearing. "Your deeds have proven you. Now you must choose." The words hit Thomas harder than the storm. He saw it all again. The cold water, the dead weight of a fainting body, his last spare blankets draped over strangers. He did it because it was the right thing to do. That's what a man does. Rescue had felt simple, necessary. This felt like stepping onto a trail that had no end. Kuruk's eyes never left his face. "Our law is older than this grass," he said, his voice as calm as a judge's. "A man who saves an unmarried woman shows himself worthy to be considered as husband." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You saved 3. The world tilted under Thomas's boots. His coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the porch steps. This wasn't about gratitude. This was an obligation, carved into a tradition he didn't understand. Yesterday's simple act of kindness had woken up an ancient law, and on this prairie, with 3 pairs of unblinking eyes on him, Thomas Ward understood. Mercy had a price, and the bill had just arrived. He looked past the chief to the 3 women. Daughters. He now knew they were the chief's daughters. The word still felt like a hammer blow. Yesterday they were strangers. Today they were his destiny. The first, Ayana, was the tallest. Her gaze was sharp, analytical. She looked at his withered vegetable garden, then back at him, and he felt like she could see every failed crop he'd ever planted. The second, Cassina, was leaner, her body coiled with a restless energy. Her eyes were on his corral, where 2 thin horses stood listlessly. She saw his poverty in their ribs, in the leaning fences. The third, Clara, was the quietest. Her eyes were different. They weren't judging his failures. They were looking at the cabin itself, at the patched walls and the sturdy foundation his father had laid. She saw something else entirely. "I am Kuruk," the chief had said. "These are my daughters." Now he gave Thomas a single day, 1 spin of the earth. "The sun will set once before you must decide," he'd commanded. "Use this time wisely. Choose one, become a husband, bind their peoples in an alliance." Thomas's mouth was desert dry. He was a poor rancher, a nobody. His life was a series of managed failures. What could he possibly offer women like them? He tried to explain. He gestured at the sagging barn, the thin cattle, the dust where grass should be. "Look at me," he pleaded. "I have nothing." Kuruk's gaze was like granite. Wealth is not only in cattle or gold. A man who risks his life for strangers shows greater riches than one who hoards what he has. But Thomas didn't feel rich. He felt trapped. As if guided by an unspoken signal, the three women began to move. They didn't wait for his permission. They stepped onto his land as if they already had a right to it. Ayanna walked straight to the withered garden. She knelt, running her fingers through the parched dirt, her expression unreadable. Casina moved toward the corral, her steps sure and steady. She didn't look at the horses. She looked at the fence, at the gate, at the way the land sloped toward the creek. Clara went to the old well near the cabin. She ignored the frayed rope and the cracked bucket. She stared down into the darkness, as if listening for something only she could hear. They weren't just looking. They were dissecting his life: soil, livestock, water, the three pillars of survival, the three pillars of his failure. Thomas stood frozen, a prisoner on his own porch. He watched them, and a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't a choice he was making. It was a test, and he was already failing. Ayanna looked up from the garden, her hand full of dry soil. "This earth thirsts for knowledge as much as water," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried across the yard like a prophecy. It wasn't a riddle. It was an accusation. From the corral, Casina's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "These horses know hardship, but they have not forgotten trust." The words weren't about the animals. They were about him, about the man who had cared for them, even when he could barely care for himself. Then came Clara from the well. She had pulled up the bucket. It was empty, save for a few inches of muddy water at the bottom. She looked at him, her gentle eyes holding a surprising intensity. "Some things run deeper than what shows on the surface," she said softly. Each statement was a chisel, chipping away at the simple man he thought he was. They saw past the ragged clothes and the failing ranch. They saw something inside him, something raw and unguarded, something he didn't even know was there. Chief Kuruk remained by the cabin, his arms folded. He was watching the entire exchange, his face a mask of stone. "You doubt yourself," he stated. It wasn't a question. Thomas finally found his voice, gesturing helplessly. "Look at them, strong, proud, and look at me. My fences are falling. I have nothing to offer them." Kuruk's eyes narrowed. "What do you think they see when they look at you?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd never considered it. He'd only ever seen his own shortcomings. "Yesterday they were drowning," Kuruk pressed on, his voice relentless. "Today they are alive. You left the safety of your home to walk into a storm-swollen creek for strangers. You gave your only blankets. You asked for nothing." "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas mumbled. The words felt weak, even to his own ears. A strange, almost smile creased Kuruk's weathered face. "Is it?" That simple question hung in the air, burning away every excuse Thomas had ever made for himself. He had measured his worth in cattle and coin, in acres and fences. They were measuring him by something else entirely. And for the first time, Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him, not with fear, but with the terrifying possibility that these women, this chief, they saw a man he had never dared to see in himself. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the women returned. They didn't come empty-handed. Ayanna stepped forward first. She opened her palms to reveal a small handful of seeds she'd salvaged from his dying plants. "Life still lingers here," she said, her eyes meeting his. "It only waits for guidance." It was a promise and a challenge. Casina followed. She wasn't leading his horse. The weary mare was following her, its head held high, a new light in its eyes. "Your horses remember trust," she said. "They only needed someone to remind them." She had mended a section of the fence with knots Thomas had never seen before, tight and unbreakable. Then Clara, in her hands she cradled a wooden bucket, but it wasn't filled with water. It held his father's old tools, chisels, hammers, a hand plane. She had found them in the back of the barn, cleaned them, oiled them. They looked ready for use, not like relics of a better time. Foundations matter, she said, her voice simple and true. A home stands or falls by how it is cared for. Thomas stared at the gifts, seeds of hope, a symbol of trust renewed, the tools of his own legacy. These weren't just tokens, they were reflections of him. They had taken the broken pieces of his life and shown him that they still held promise. Then the ground shifted again. The choice our father demands is not yours alone, Ayanna said, her voice sharp. Cassina stepped forward. We must also choose. Clara's quiet voice delivered the final blow to his understanding. A husband is not taken by tradition alone. He must be wanted. His throat went tight. He had been so focused on his own inadequacy, he never realized they were judging him as much as he was judging them. This wasn't a prize to be won. It was a partnership to be forged. And then, one by one, they laid their terms bare. If you choose me, Ayanna said, her gaze intense, I will teach you the secrets of the soil. Together, we will make this land flourish. If you choose me, Cassina stated, her posture ramrod straight, I will bring my knowledge of horses. We will build herds that outlast any storm. If you choose me, Clara finished, her voice a calm anchor in his swirling thoughts, I will help you build something that lasts. Not just walls and roofs, but a foundation for generations. These were not romantic proposals. They were business plans, vows of survival, contracts for a future he'd never imagined. But then came the conditions. The real test. Ayanna's voice sharpened. But know this. We will not marry a man who sees himself as less than he is. Cassina's tone was like iron. We will not bind ourselves to someone who apologizes for his own worth. And Clara, with her quiet strength, delivered the final truth. And we will not choose a man who believes wealth is counted only in gold and cattle. The words hung in the twilight. They were both a judgment and an invitation. They weren't asking him to be rich. They weren't asking him to be powerful. They were asking him to have the courage to see himself through their eyes. And Thomas Ward, the poor rancher who thought he had nothing, realized this choice had nothing to do with them. It had everything to do with him. Could he become the man they already saw? That night, sleep was a stranger. Thomas sat on his porch, staring at the flicker of their campfire across the yard. He could hear their voices, a low murmur in a language he didn't know, but the meaning felt clear. They were discussing him, deciding his fate. He thought of Ayanna's hands in the dirt, finding life where he saw only dust. He thought of Cassina's calm command over his horse, seeing resilience where he saw only weakness. And he thought of Clara, holding his father's tools, seeing legacy where he saw only decay. Each woman offered a piece of the man he could be, a piece he desperately needed. But their conditions echoed louder than their promises. They would not stand with a man who believed himself worthless. And that was the one truth he couldn't escape. He'd lived with that feeling his whole life. It was a part of him, like the dirt under his nails. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky, a decision settled in his heart. It wasn't a choice between the three women. It was a choice to show them who he truly was, the one part of himself he had never measured in cattle or fences. He walked toward their camp. They fell silent as he approached. Kuruk's eyes were sharp, questioning. Thomas didn't speak. He just beckoned for them to follow. He led them up a small, grassy rise behind his cabin, a place hidden from the main yard. There, arranged in quiet rows, stood a cluster of wooden grave markers, weathered and simple, but straight and carefully tended. These, Thomas began, his voice husky, are not my kin. The four of them looked at the dozen or so graves, then back at him. Confusion warred with curiosity on their faces. They were travelers, he explained, letting his hand rest on one of the wooden crosses. Families caught by sickness, strangers who froze in the winters, people who had nowhere else to go. He looked at Kuruk. I buried them. I carved their markers. And for 8 years I've tended their graves. Not because anyone asked me to. Not for any reward. He paused, the truth of it raw in his throat. Because the dead deserve dignity. Ayana knelt beside one of the markers, her fingers gently brushing away a bit of dust. You gave them honor when they had none left, she whispered. Thomas swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on a tiny marker at the end of a row. When I found your daughters in that flood, I didn't think about worthiness. I didn't think about whether I had the strength. I just knew they needed help. He pointed to the small grave. Like she did. A baby girl. Lived and died in a single night in a covered wagon. Her parents were half mad with grief. I couldn't save her. His voice broke just for a second. But I could make sure she wasn't forgotten. A new silence fell over the small cemetery. It was different from the tense silences of the day before. This one was filled with a dawning understanding. Cassina's usually stoic expression softened. Most men measure their worth in what they own, she said, her eyes searching his. You measure it in how you honor the powerless. Clara stood slowly, her gaze steady and deep. You understand the difference between surviving and living with purpose. That is not the heart of a poor man. It is the heart of a chief. Thomas blinked. The heart of a chief. Him. Then Chief Kuruk stepped forward. His face was still stern, but something in his eyes had changed. Approval. Respect. He laid a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. Now, he said, his voice a low rumble, now you begin to understand your own value, not because of what you own, but because of what you give when no one is watching. For the first time since they arrived, Thomas felt something inside him unknot. It wasn't pride, it was a quiet, solid truth. He wasn't defined by his barren fields. He was defined by this hill. He was a man who stood up. A man who carried strangers through storms and laid the forgotten to rest. The women looked at him now, and the judgment was gone. They weren't seeing a candidate bound by law. They were seeing a man. But as this new understanding settled between them, a cold wind swept down from the high ridges. It wasn't a natural wind. It carried a scent of pine and something else, something like old iron and cold stone. Cassina was the first to react. Her head snapped up, her eyes fixed on the dark tree line far beyond the corral. The calm confidence she'd worn all day vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure, undiluted fear. They have found us, she whispered, and the words were so cold they could have frozen the morning sun. Thomas looked from her terrified face to the ridge. He saw nothing but trees. Who found you? Kuruk's hand tightened on his shoulder, a silent command to be still. The chief's weathered face had become a mask of grim resolve. Ayana rose from the graveside, her hand instinctively going to a small knife sheathed at her belt. Even Clara, the calm and steady one, took a half-step back, placing herself closer to her father. They were afraid, truly afraid. It was not the storm, Ayana said, her voice tight. We were not just caught in a flood. We were running. The world tilted again for Thomas. The entire story he'd been told was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Their arrival here, the rescue, the ancient law, it was all built on a foundation he couldn't see. Running from what? He demanded. Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed from the ridge. It was a cry that was half human, half animal. A sound of pure malice that scraped along Thomas's spine and made the hair on his arms stand up. His 2 horses in the corral screamed in terror, crashing against the fence Cassina had just mended. Kuruk's eyes met his, and for the first time Thomas saw not a chief demanding a choice, but a father desperate to protect his children. "The law I spoke of is real, Thomas Ward," the chief said, his voice low and urgent. "But there is another part of it, a part I did not share." He glanced at his daughters, a silent apology in his eyes. "The law does not just offer the hand of a daughter," he said, his gaze returning to Thomas, hard as diamonds. "It demands a guardian. The man who saves them must also be strong enough to defend them." The test wasn't about his worthiness to be a husband, it was about his ability to be a warrior, and the enemy was already at his gate. "What is out there?" Thomas asked again, his mind racing. The strange wind, the unnatural cry, the terror in their eyes. It didn't add up. Kuruk pointed a single steady finger toward the high ridge. "The reason your soil is barren," he said, his words landing like stones. "The reason your cattle are thin and your water is bitter." Thomas stared, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" "This land is not poor, Thomas Ward," Ayana cut in, her voice sharp with urgency. "It is sick, poisoned. Something has been bleeding it dry for years. It is why you have failed to make it thrive." His failures. The constant struggle he'd always blamed on himself, on his own lack of skill. All this time it was something else. "For generations my people have known of the shadow that lives on that ridge," Kuruk continued. "Men who are not men. They take from the earth, but they do not give back. They hoard its life and leave only dust behind. A rival tribe, prospectors." Thomas's mind couldn't grasp it. "We came here seeking an old alliance," Cassina explained, her eyes still scanning the trees. "We were ambushed. They drove us toward the creek, hoping the storm would finish us. So the rescue, it wasn't an accident. It was the end of a desperate flight. They hadn't stumbled onto his land. They had been driven here." "Why me?" Thomas asked, the question feeling small and foolish. "Why my land?" Clara, who had been silent, finally spoke. Her hand rested on the foundation stone of his cabin. "Because of what is beneath it," she said. Her words were barely a whisper, but they shook him to his core. "Your father did not just build a home here," she said, her eyes meeting his. "He built a cage." The world spun. A cage? What was she talking about? Kuruk nodded grimly. "Your father was a wise man, wiser than you know. He understood what slept beneath this valley. He found the heart of the poison and built his house upon it, using stone and iron and sigils my people had long forgotten. He trapped it. Trapped it." The word made no sense, but the look on their faces told him it was deadly true. "The men on the ridge, they do not want the land," Kuruk said. "They want to set free what your father locked away." Suddenly, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The test, the choice, it was never about marriage. Kuruk wasn't looking for a son-in-law. He was looking for an heir, a new guardian for the cage his father had built. He hadn't saved the chief's daughters. They had come to find him, to see if the son had the same strength as the father. Another cry echoed from the ridge, closer this time, a howling, hungry sound. "They grow bold," Ayana hissed. "The storm weakened the wards your father set." "And your presence here," Cassina added, looking at Thomas, "your blood has woken it up." Thomas felt a dizzying rush of anger and fear. His entire life had been a lie. He wasn't a failed rancher. He was a jailer, and he had never even known there was a prisoner. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice shaking but finding a new hardness. Kuruk looked at his three daughters and then back at Thomas. The time for tests was over. "Today you do not choose a wife," the chief declared, his voice ringing with ancient authority. "Today you choose to stand, you choose to fight, or you choose to run and let the shadow consume everything your father died to protect." There was no real choice, not for a man who tended the graves of strangers. "My father didn't run," Thomas said, his hand balling into a fist. "Neither will I. For the first time, he saw Chief Kuruk smile. It was a grim, terrifying thing. "Good," the chief said. "Then the lessons can truly begin." The trial wasn't over. It had just started, and it wouldn't be a test of farming or horse taming. It would be a test of survival, and the final exam was coming for them, whether they were ready or not. The lessons began immediately. There was no time to waste. The sun was climbing higher, and the feeling of being watched from the ridge was a physical pressure on the back of Thomas's neck. Kuruk laid out the brutal truth. The attackers, he called them the Dust Walkers, were not numerous, but they were relentless. They fought with cunning and cruelty, using the land itself as a weapon. "They will not attack in the full light of day," Kuruk explained. "They are creatures of dusk and shadow. We have until sunset to prepare." The ranch, once a symbol of Thomas's failure, was now their fortress, and the three sisters were his tutors in the art of war. The first lesson was with Ayana. She did not take him to the garden. She took him to the creek, to the very spot where he had pulled her from the raging water. "An enemy believes he knows your land better than you do," she said, pointing to the muddy banks. "We will use that pride against him." She taught him things about the earth he'd lived on his whole life but never seen. She showed him how the soft mud near the water could be turned into a hidden trap. She pointed out clusters of thorned vines that could be woven into barriers. She showed him which plants, when crushed, released a scent that would confuse a tracker's senses. This wasn't farming. This was turning the soil into an ally. "You see with a rancher's eyes," she told him, her hands deftly setting a snare made of roots and flexible branches. "You see what the land can give you. You must learn to see what it can take away from your enemy." Together they worked along the perimeter of his property. They dug pits and covered them with branches. They wove nets of thorns. They didn't build a wall. They turned the very ground into a weapon. Thomas learned fast, his hands already calloused from work, now learning the deadlier arts of survival. He looked at this woman, who just a day ago he thought was judging his poor crops. He realized she wasn't just a farmer. She was a strategist, reading the battlefield in the language of soil and stone. By midday, the second lesson began with Casina. She met him at the corral. The horses were still skittish, their eyes wide with fear. "Courage and fear are a stampede," she said, calming the mare with a touch and a soft word. "Once one starts running, they all follow." She looked pointedly at him. "It is the same with men." Her domain was not just horses, but movement, speed, the flow of a battle. "The dust walkers are fast," she explained. "They move like ghosts through the trees. We cannot outrun them on foot, but we can outthink them." She taught him how to use the horses not just for a charge, but as diversions. She showed him how to rig saddles with noisemakers, bundles of tin cans and old metal that could be sent running in one direction to draw the enemy's attention. "They will expect a direct fight," she said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. "They will expect us to huddle in the cabin and wait for them. We will not do what they expect." She had him ride the gelding across the open prairie, not in a straight line, but in unpredictable patterns, showing him how to create the illusion of more riders than there actually were. It was a dance of deception, using the vast emptiness of the prairie as a stage. Thomas, who had only ever used his horses for herding cattle, was now learning to use them as instruments of psychological warfare. Casina wasn't just a horsewoman. She was a master of tactics, of feints and misdirection. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the final lesson fell to Clara. She stood waiting for him on the porch of the cabin. She held one of his father's hammers in her hand. "A fortress is only as strong as its heart," she said, her calm voice a stark contrast to the urgent preparations. "And this cabin is the heart." She did not teach him how to fight. She taught him how to endure. Clara took him inside. She showed him the genius of his father's design. He had always seen patched walls and a drafty roof. She showed him hidden braces in the walls, firing slits disguised as cracks in the wood, and floors reinforced to be unbreachable from below. "Your father built this place to withstand a siege," she said with quiet reverence. Then she led him to the hearth. She pointed to a large, flat stone that had always been loose. "Help me," she said. Together they pried the stone free. Beneath it was a dark, square hole, a hidden cellar he never knew existed. Clara lit a lantern and descended the stone steps. Thomas followed, his heart pounding. The cellar was small and dry. On one wall hung his father's old hunting rifle, meticulously cleaned and oiled, beside a heavy box of ammunition. On another wall were maps of the valley, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. And in the center of the room, carved into the very bedrock the cabin was built on, was a sprawling, intricate symbol. A spiral of interlocking lines and ancient script that seemed to pulse with a faint, cold energy. "The lock," Clara whispered, her lantern light dancing across the carving. "This is what holds the prisoner. This is what they want to destroy." Thomas reached out a hand, feeling a strange vibration in the air around the symbol. It felt like a low hum, a deep power held in check. His father had lived on top of this his entire life, guarding it without ever telling him. "The lessons of my sisters will keep the enemy at the gates," Clara said, turning to face him in the small lamplit space. "But this is where the final battle will be fought. If they break through, you must hold this room. You must protect this symbol, no matter the cost." She wasn't a builder. She was a guardian, the keeper of the final line of defense. They ascended back into the cabin as the last rays of sunlight bled from the sky. The prairie was sinking into a deep, menacing twilight. Thomas looked at the three sisters. Ayana, the Earth Warden; Cassina, the Master of Motion; Clara, the Keeper of the Heart. He had thought he was supposed to choose one. He now understood he needed all of them. They were three parts of a single, brilliant strategy for survival. A low horn blast echoed from the ridge, a signal of the coming attack. The lessons were over. The test was about to begin. Darkness fell like a shroud. The world outside the cabin's small windows dissolved into an ocean of black. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the frantic thumping of Thomas's own heart. He stood in the center of the room, his father's rifle cold and heavy in his hands. Kuruk stood by the door, a war axe resting on his shoulder. His face was impassive, but his eyes were alive, scanning the darkness. Clara was checking the braces on the window shutters, her movements economical and precise. Ayana and Cassina were gone. They had slipped out into the twilight moments before, melting into the landscape they had spent the day weaponizing. The waiting was a torture unlike any he had ever known. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. "They are here," Kuruk said, his voice a low rumble. He hadn't seen anything. He had felt it, a change in the air, a pressure. Then the first scream. It came from the direction of the creek. It was a cry of pain and surprise, cut short abruptly. It wasn't human. It was one of them. One of Ayana's traps had been sprung. Silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. They knew the ground was treacherous now. They would be more careful. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Thomas's knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. Suddenly, a new sound. The wild drumming of hooves, accompanied by a chaotic clanging of metal. It was coming from the east, far to the left of the cabin. Cassina's diversion. In the faint moonlight, Thomas could just make out the dark shapes of his two horses, galloping riderless across the prairie, the bundles of scrap metal tied to their saddles, raising a terrible din. A series of guttural shouts erupted from the darkness, following the sound of the horses. They had taken the bait. "Brace the door," Kuruk commanded. Just as Thomas slammed the heavy bar across the door, the first attacker hit the cabin. It struck the wall with a heavy, meaty thud, like a thrown sack of grain. Then another and another. They were testing the defenses. Thomas rushed to one of the firing slits Clara had shown him. Peering through, he got his first look at a dust walker. It was shaped like a man, but it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its skin was the color of ash, and its eyes glowed with a faint, sickly green light. It carried a crude weapon, something between a club and a spear. He saw another one trying to tear a shutter from a window, its long, spindly fingers scrabbling at the wood. This was real. The monster from the ridge was trying to break into his home. Thomas raised the rifle, aimed, and fired. The boom echoed in the small cabin, and the creature at the window shrieked and fell back. But two more immediately took its place. The cabin was surrounded. The assault was relentless. They threw themselves against the walls, clawed at the roof, and hammered on the door with their crude weapons. The entire structure groaned under the attack. Clara's work, his father's work, was all that kept them from being torn apart. "They are a swarm," Kuruk grunted, swinging his axe to splinter the hand of a creature that had punched through a weak spot in the wall. "Mindless, but their masters are not." As if on cue, a new sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, commanding whistle from the darkness. Instantly, the attack on the cabin ceased. The scratching and pounding stopped. An eerie silence fell. "A feint," Kuruk breathed, his eyes narrowing. "They were testing us, drawing our attention here." Thomas's blood ran cold. Attention from what? The answer came in a flash of brilliant green light from the back of the cabin, followed by the sound of splintering rock. "The cellar!" Clara cried. They had ignored the cabin's defenses. They were going for the foundation directly. They were trying to get to the lock. Kuruk and Thomas scrambled toward the hearth, pulling the stone slab free. Green light pulsed from the darkness below, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. The humming energy Thomas had felt earlier was now a screaming, discordant shriek. Down in the cellar, 3 dust walkers stood over the carved symbol on the floor. They held long iron rods, which they were using to smash at the intricate lines. With every strike, the symbol flared, and a crack would appear in the bedrock. The prison was breaking. Kuruk let out a war cry and leaped down the steps, his axe a blur of motion. The first creature went down, its head cleaved in two. Thomas followed, firing the rifle from the hip. The blast threw the second creature back against the wall, but the third ignored them completely. It raised its rod for another strike on the weakened symbol. There was no time to reload. Thomas did the only thing he could. He charged forward, using the heavy rifle like a club, and slammed it into the creature's side. It stumbled, its glowing eyes fixing on him with pure hatred. It was stronger than it looked. It swung the iron rod, and Thomas barely got the rifle up in time to block the blow. The stock splintered, the impact jarring him to the bone. He was disarmed. The dust walker grinned, a horrifying sight of jagged teeth, and raised the rod to finish him. Suddenly, an arrow sprouted from its chest. It gasped, the green light in its eyes flickering, and then another arrow took it in the throat. It collapsed onto the floor, dead. Ayana stood on the cellar steps, a bow in her hand. Cassina was right behind her, a pair of wicked-looking knives in hers. They had slipped back inside during the chaos of the feint attack. But the danger wasn't over. The symbol on the floor was cracked, a deep fissure running right through its center. The cold energy that poured from it was no longer a hum. It was a gale. The air grew frigid, and a low, guttural laughter seemed to echo from the very rock beneath their feet. The laughter of the prisoner waking up. "It is too late," Ayana whispered, her face pale. "The lock is broken." Outside, the horn blew again. But this time it wasn't a signal of attack. It was a signal of triumph. The remaining dust walkers were retreating, their work done. They hadn't needed to destroy the cabin. They had only needed to crack the foundation. Silence descended once more, but this was the silence of the grave. They had survived the battle, but they were about to lose the war. The cold pouring from the cellar was a physical presence. It leached the warmth from the room, frosting the edges of the stone floor. The low, mocking laughter from beneath the rock was getting stronger, a voice that had been sleeping for decades, now stirring with malevolent glee. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Kuruk knelt, his hand hovering over the cracked symbol. The energy coming from it made his fingers tremble. "The lock will fail completely by sunrise," the chief said grimly. "When it does, the thing your father bound will be free." "What is it?" Thomas needed to know. "What did he trap down there?" "A hunger," Ayana said, her gaze fixed on the fissure. "An ancient spirit that eats the life of the land. It is what made this place barren. If it gets out, it will not stop with this valley. It will consume everything." So this was the real enemy. The dust walkers were just servants, trying to unleash their master. "Can we fix it?" Thomas asked, looking at Clara. "Can we repair the symbol?" Clara shook her head, her expression full of despair. "The carving requires a ritual. It needs materials we do not have, and it needs a blood sacrifice. The original guardian, your father, gave his life to create it. His energy is woven into the rock. His father had sacrificed himself. That's why he'd never told Thomas. He had died to protect his son from this burden. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. "There is another way," Kuruk said, rising to his feet. His face was set in lines of terrible resolve. "A desperate way. The symbol cannot be repaired, but it can be reinforced. For a time." "How?" Cassina asked. "The ritual requires the blood of a guardian," Kuruk said, his eyes meeting Thomas's. "But the legends say it also responds to a willing heart, a spirit of equal strength, a chief." The implication was horrifyingly clear. "No, father," Ayana cried, stepping forward. "This is my duty," Kuruk said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I brought this battle to this man's door. I will not see the world fall because of it. He was going to sacrifice himself to seal the breach, to buy them time." "There must be another way," Thomas insisted. "There is not," Kuruk said. He looked at Thomas, and the command in his eyes was absolute. "Your duty is to your father's legacy. You are the guardian now. You must live. You must learn. You must find a way to make the lock permanent again. I will give you that time." He turned to his daughters. "You will stay with him. You will teach him our ways. You will help him become the man this land needs him to be." It was his final command. Kuruk walked to the center of the cellar and stood upon the cracked symbol. He drew a long, ceremonial knife from his belt. The blade seemed to hum in the cold air. He began to chant in his native tongue, his voice echoing in the small chamber. The words were filled with power and sorrow. As he chanted, the fractured lines of the symbol on the floor began to glow with a soft, white light. The cold gale lessened, and the evil laughter from below faltered, replaced by a howl of rage. The ritual was working, but the cost was unthinkable. Thomas looked at the faces of the three sisters. Ayana was weeping silently, her warrior's facade broken. Cassina stared, her jaw clenched, biting back her own grief. Clara had her eyes closed, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. They were about to watch their father die, and it was all because of him. Because he'd been on this land, because he'd saved them. The chain of events had led to this moment, and he felt powerless to stop it. Kuruk finished his chant. He looked at his children one last time, a look of infinite love and pride on his face. Then he looked at Thomas. "Be worthy," he said, and he raised the knife. But before he could complete the sacrifice, a new voice spoke from the top of the cellar stairs. No, it was Clara. Her eyes were open now, and they burned with an intensity Thomas had never seen. "There is another way," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "The legends do not only speak of a chief's sacrifice." Everyone froze, staring at her. Kuruk lowered the knife slightly, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "The strength of a chief is in his spirit," Clara said, walking slowly down the stairs. "But the strength of a foundation is in the bond that holds the stones together." She stopped beside Thomas and took his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "The ritual doesn't just demand the blood of a guardian or the spirit of a chief," she continued, her eyes locked with her father's. "It speaks of a third power, the strongest of all, the joining of two houses, the union of a guardian and a partner, freely chosen, bound not by law, but by heart. A marriage, a true marriage, not the one demanded by tradition, but a willing, powerful bond. It will take both of us," she said, turning her burning gaze to Thomas. "It will drain us. It may even kill us. But our combined strength can seal the breach. It can do what one person's sacrifice cannot." For a moment, no one spoke. The howling from beneath the floor intensified, as if the entity knew what was being proposed. It was afraid of this. Thomas looked at Clara, at her steady eyes, her unwavering resolve. In the midst of all this chaos and death, she was offering not a sacrifice, but a union, a partnership, a chance to build something instead of just losing something. This was the real choice. Not which woman he would take, but which future he would build. He had learned from Ayana how to make the earth strong. He had learned from Cassina how to be a strategist, and from Clara he had learned that foundations matter. This was the foundation. He tightened his grip on her hand. "I choose you," he said, and the words were not an answer to a chief's command. They were a vow. Clara looked at her father. "The choice has been made, freely, as it was meant to be." Kuruk stared at them, his eyes wide with a mix of shock, fear, and dawning hope. He slowly lowered the knife. Ayana and Cassina rushed to Clara's side, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. "Sister, you can't," Ayana pleaded. "We can," Clara said, her voice firm. She never took her eyes off Thomas. "Together." And together they stepped onto the broken symbol. The moment their feet touched the stone, the howling from below became a deafening roar. The cellar plunged into an almost absolute darkness, broken only by the angry, pulsing green light from the crack. A wave of despair washed over Thomas, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was the entity's direct influence, a poison for the soul, whispering every doubt and failure he'd ever had directly into his mind. "You are worthless. You are weak. You will fail, just like you always have." He stumbled, but Clara's grip on his hand was an anchor. "Don't listen," she said, her own voice strained. "It feeds on doubt. Remember who you are." Who was he? For a moment, the voice of the entity was all he could hear. He was the poor rancher, the man with nothing. Then he remembered the graves on the hill. He remembered pulling strangers from a flood. He remembered the look in Kuruk's eyes when he'd said, "Be worthy." He was the guardian. Thomas planted his feet, pushing back against the tide of despair with a force of will he never knew he possessed. He focused on Clara, on the warmth of her hand, on the courage in her eyes. "What do we do?" he asked, shouting to be heard over the roar. "We give it a memory," Clara shouted back. "The foundation is made of stone and iron, but the lock is made of will. We pour our own strength into it, our own story." She closed her eyes. Thomas did the same. He didn't know how to do this, so he just followed her lead. He let his mind go, not to the darkness, but to the life he had lived on this land. He thought of his father, the quiet strength in the man's hands as he laid the foundation stones. He pushed that memory, that feeling of love and permanence, down through his feet and into the symbol. The green light flickered. The roar lessened just a bit. Clara squeezed his hand. He felt a surge of her own memories. The taste of clean water from a mountain stream, the strength of a running horse, the deep, abiding love for her sisters and her father. She poured it all into the lock. The white light along the cracks began to glow brighter, pushing back the green. The entity fought back. It showed him visions of his ranch burning, of the graves on the hill being desecrated, of the sisters falling one by one. It showed him his own death, alone and forgotten in the dust. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced him. He faltered again, but then he felt Ayana and Kisina place their hands on their shoulders. They weren't part of the ritual, but they were adding their strength, their support. He felt Ayana's connection to the unyielding earth. He felt Kisina's fierce, untamable spirit. And through it all, he felt Kuruk, watching them, his will a shield around them all. He was not alone. This was his land. This was his home. Thomas opened his eyes, staring into the darkness. "No," he said, his voice quiet but unbreakable. "You are the stranger here. You are the one who is forgotten." He didn't just push a memory into the lock. He pushed his entire being, his stubbornness, his quiet refusal to let things die, the simple kindness of giving a blanket to a stranger, the dignity he gave to the dead, the love he felt blooming in his heart for the woman standing beside him. He poured everything he was into the stone. Clara cried out, her body trembling with the effort. A brilliant, blinding white light erupted from the symbol on the floor. It was not the cold light of the lock, but something new, something warm and alive. The roar from below turned into a final, agonized shriek of pure agony. And then, silence. The green light was gone. The cold was gone. The cellar was filled with a warm white glow, which slowly pulsed, sealing the cracks in the stone not with rock, but with light itself. Thomas collapsed, the strength leaving his body all at once. Clara fell with him, their hands still clasped together. They lay on the floor, exhausted but alive, bathed in the gentle light of the newly forged ward. The battle was over. The prisoner was silent, and the foundation was stronger than ever before. 6 months later, the ranch was unrecognizable. Under Ayana's guidance, the fields were no longer barren. Rows of corn and beans stood tall and green, thriving in soil that was finally healing. The life of the land was returning. Casina's knowledge had transformed the small herd. A half-dozen new foals kicked playfully in a newly built, massive corral. They were the beginning of a herd that would one day be legendary. And Clara's touch was everywhere. The cabin was reinforced, the barn roof was sturdy, and a new wall of river stones surrounded the homestead. It wasn't a place of survival anymore. It was a place of permanence, a home. Thomas stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. He was no longer the hunched, defeated man who apologized for his own existence. He stood tall, his shoulders back. The land had been transformed, but so had the man. Clara came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. Their bond, forged in the heart of the cellar, was deeper than any vow. Ayana and Casina joined them, no longer guests, but family. Their father, Kuruk, had returned to his people, but he visited often, the alliance between the ranch and the tribe now unbreakable. They had faced the darkness and won. They had turned a cursed land into a sanctuary. Thomas knew the prisoner beneath the floor still slept, and that he would be the guardian of that lock for the rest of his days. But he was not afraid. He knew that true strength wasn't found in what you owned or what you conquered. It was found in the foundations you build, the life you nurture, the trust you earn, and the bonds you forge with the people you love. His father had taught him how to be a guardian. Kuruk had taught him how to be a chief. But the sisters, they had taught him how to truly live. If you enjoyed this story of courage and unexpected destiny, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the edge of the known world.